Ladies and gentlemen, episode 13 of the Kurz Wind Podcast, the lucky number 13, as fate would have it. We have Sam Tasker on from WindEsco. He's the Vice President of Sales and has over 12 years of experience in the wind space, ranging from some of the largest OEMs and largest owner-operators in the world. Sam has graciously accepted an invite to partake in episode 13 of the Kurz Wind Podcast. Unfortunately, I didn't tell him it was episode 13. Otherwise, we might have had to reschedule. So, Sam, I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, luckily, I'm not too superstitious, and this is working out just great.
You're not superstitious, just a little stitious, right?
It's a little, that's right.
Shout out if you know that reference from The Office. Sam, I actually want to jump right into it since we have limited time, and we have a lot of interest from not only internally at Kurz Wind, but also customers to hear more about what you guys are doing and revolutionizing in the wind space. So if you don't mind starting with WindEsco, could you give me the quick overview of what your company actually does for wind?
Yeah, absolutely. WindEsco fits into the category of engineering and analytics, which doesn't tell you much and is quite a competitive space. And what's unique about us is our focus on operating turbines. That means what's the turbine doing when it's online? And how do you optimize that performance and that production for owners to get the most out of the asset potential? That's the short story with a variety of things and tools we use to look at that we don't see being done widespread in the industry yet.
That is, I'm excited to dive into that. And there's a lot that goes into it, as we've discussed offline prior to hitting go on this podcast. But I first want to know about you in particular. Could you talk about your background in wind and the evolution of your career to now end up at WindEsco?
Sure. And first of all, I had no plan to ever get into renewables. And now that I'm here, I love it and love the people we work with, both in renewables and power generation. Life grew up in South Florida, and my course took me through school, through the U.S. Navy, and I got to see the world. And I wanted to try corporate America. I had some reasons why I didn't want to make a career out of the military, and I decided to get out. And I came across this other company from South Florida called FPL, and I was immediately drawn to this company because their reputation was incredible. And I served with FPL, but they shipped me off to Iowa from Florida. So I served out in Iowa and Colorado with what became NextEra Energy Resources that many people know a little bit of the story of, which was my foundation from the military to corporate America. And I ran into some opportunities, one of which was to go help at Pattern when Pattern was really starting to grow, 2013 timeframe. And we tripled the size of that company just in 3 years. At a time when we were coming off of a financial difficult period that started in 2008. So it's been a blessing to be in renewables, which has continued to grow. I've continued to hire or be hired through some ups and downs in the market. The time at Pattern took me full circle back in touch with Siemens, which is based out of Orlando, Florida, here, my home area, and that's how I ended up back here and have been with WindEsco now this past year. Talking to you today. So that's the quick version of how I got here, Dan.
I love it. Sam, what drew you to taking on this role at WindEsco? Was it previous experiences at different companies that you work for that you just alluded to, and seeing an opportunity in the market to maybe potentially service them with what WindEsco does?
Absolutely. Two things. And yeah, I think important question. I tasted a lot of big organizations, government, corporate wind, owner, and OEM. And I wanted to get an experience with a smaller organization, number one. Number two, I met a founder who had the same values in the market about ownership and helping owners overcome barriers in the market, many of which are keeping the market from performing better. And we're doing things to help those owners get through some of those barriers and get the most out of renewables for our whole industry.
You talk about getting the most out of renewables, and the acronym that you see on your website, your case studies, that's referenced a lot is AEP. Could you maybe tell us what that stands for and what that actually entails?
Sure. Annual energy production, AEP. It gets thrown around a lot, and there's a lot of ways to improve it. You can improve it by turning something off and on. But in the case of a wind turbine, it's not like a lawnmower. A lawnmower is either off or on, and when it's on, it's running. But on a wind turbine, we have this thing called a power curve, and you have different output at different wind speeds because the wind speeds are variable. And within that space of that rated power to off are a myriad of places where wind turbines could be performing better or worse. And we're experts in that area of how that turbine's performing when the turbine's on, so that you can get the most out of that turbine at any wind speed.
How is that tracked? I'm always curious about how you're able to track AEP, and maybe it's as simple as pulling from SCADA, I don't know, so pardon my naivete here, but how do you guys actually pull those metrics?
Yeah, well, first of all, most of that information is public, and you can look at the Department of Energy's website, because the primary thing you need to know is how many kilowatt hours you produce. And with some simple math based on the size and nameplate of the turbine, the number of hours it was online, you can do some figures to figure out how much each turbine made, and break that down in a variety of ways.
One question that was prompted by a customer of mine, they wanted to know the difference. And again, it might be a simple question, but curiosity is something, or at least we're curious about this answer. What is the difference between AEP and nameplate capacity? And how do they actually relate?
Sure. Nameplate is what a piece of equipment is designed for. And these terms existed well before wind and renewables in the power generation space with gas turbines, steam turbines, et cetera. So a lot of these principles are easy to read about in Wikipedia or wherever you do your research. And so nameplate is what that turbine's designed to produce. And so, for example, a very common nameplate in North America is 1.5. And comparing that to AEP is something that you would look at on that 1.5, what we would call the rated level. That's the most it's rated to produce. And there's some things that can help it perform above rated, and there's some things that cause it to perform below rated. But keep in mind, on a wind turbine, that power is on a curve of available wind speed and output. And within that space, that rated power performs below that nameplate capacity.
So would you say the goal of WindEsco is to make sure that you're trying to push the power output as close to nameplate capacity, based on wind speeds, of course, as well, as possible?
I think that's a really good question, because a perception is often that you're trying to make something go from that example of a 1.5 to a 1.6 to get more. But in many cases, when you make something make 1.6 instead of 1.5, you might be losing power in other areas of performance when it's not at its maximum rated capacity. And it's within that space, what we call region 2. It's the middle section of the power curve. You have 1 at the bottom, 2 in the middle, 3 at the top. Region 2 of the curve is where your wind turbine's operating most of the time. By improving how the turbine operates in that area below rated speed, you will actually see more opportunity to create more power.
Is there a percentage of time that towers tend to, and it might be geographically specific, it could have other factors at play, but is there a percentage of time that towers tend to operate in that region 2 power curve? Is that a majority of the output that you'll see in a tower, or does it fluctuate, I guess, on a daily, monthly, yearly level?
Well, you hit it on the head. It absolutely depends on where the site is located. So if you take, for example, the roots in wind in California, those sites have been placed in valleys that have land and sea breeze wind patterns, and the wind rushes in and out of valleys. So you can imagine when the wind's rushing through a valley in California, it's going very fast, and that turbine is going really high and really low. And that's our most extreme example in North America. The rest of the turbines do what you just said as well. The majority of them run in the mid-wind range. And that's going to be anywhere from 6 to 9 meter seconds, where they're operating the majority of the time.
So is your focus then trying to maximize output in that 6 to 9 meter per second wind in the majority of the United States, and I guess customers that you service across the world? Or are you looking at all those different regions of the power curve to try and identify how to eke out a little bit more of that AEP, as we've discussed?
Yeah, and that's a good question too. By nature of what we do, we find more in the mid-wind ranges in region 2 of the power curve, but we look across the whole power curve.
So how would a site then adopt your technology? And maybe you can define if it's a technology or a software, or because you had mentioned you're an engineering and analytics company. So maybe we can unpack that, what that means, and then also talk about how sites can actually leverage this technology to better, I guess, work with their sites.
Yeah, absolutely. What we're doing now is neat compared to where we see ourselves going, and something we should touch on as well. But our core product applies analytics to customers' data. We aren't running a hardware and we aren't running a software on the asset. And from a change management and controls perspective, that's less complicated and preferred. It's also cheaper. So we indeed run software in our back office to analyze that data, and we have a platform, but we do not apply anything to the owner's equipment. In the future, where WindEsco is taking wind, these assets will be communicating with each other. And there's some different ways that we'll be able to apply the benefit of our analytics and platform, where some hardware and software will be required to achieve that benefit.
I think that's really neat, and I'm tempted to dive into the future of WindEsco. I'm going to save it for near the end, just to keep the listeners on the edge of their seats. But first, I want to talk about, yeah, exactly. What sort of, a lot of times when you're looking at different models of extracting data and maximizing performance, a lot of questions, at least what we get on the parts and service side, is, well, what kind of financial impact will this have on my site? If I invest X, what can I get in return? Are you guys able to run those same sort of figures of, with X investment, you can see Y output or return over a certain amount of time?
In a way, what we like to do is strive to deliver a return on investment within 1 year. We also strive to provide fixed fees for services instead of revenue sharing. We have found, not just in North America, but globally, revenue sharing is becoming less and less attractive. And what revenue sharing means is that if I know you're making a certain amount of money, that I take a portion of that benefit. And so if your partner site next door is making more, that means I would get more as well. And because of that phenomenon and distaste in the market, we use that structure with fixed fees and our goal of a 1 year payback or less.
So on your website, I was able to read one of the case studies that you guys have beautifully put together. As most people know at this point, my background's in digital marketing, so I just absolutely love a nice website, an interactive website with great case studies. It had mentioned in there, I think it was a 2% increase in AEP, and per tower it came out to something like $5,500 per tower per year in extra revenue. Are those common figures that you tend to see with customers that onboard with your engineering and analytics?
Yeah, and that's a really good question too. What's most common for owners to monitor is their availability or their outage rates. How well does the turbine stay online, and when it's online, how well is it running? And we also use AEP pretty commonly in the industry, but to compare those is difficult, and that's why we provide a dollars per megawatt improvement. That's a much easier way of normalizing a metric comparison.
So let's say I'm a new customer, and I'm super thrilled about what it is that you guys can do at WindEsco. If you don't mind, if it's not proprietary, of course, could you walk me through the onboarding process and how you would basically start to identify challenges or maybe growth opportunities I could have overlooked as a site operator?
Yeah, absolutely. I think We really do like to understand what each site's specific performance issues could be. And there are a lot. And it's important to focus on the customer's assets, business, pain. And if we lose sight of that and deliver something that we think is valuable, that's different than providing value to the customer's need. So that's the first holistic mindset you really need to understand. When we get involved, it's based on our track record possible to estimate what we should expect. And the track record based on a certain type of turbine or a certain region is something we can generalize. But what we really like to do first is get a look at the data. And this is the biggest challenge for every owner in renewables is data management. There is no standard, and therefore you see owners using different methods of keeping historical data, interacting with it visually, and then applying it for analytics. Because of that, analytics are all over the place as well. So we work specifically with owners to explain what type of data we're looking at from that asset, which many of them are not looking at already. That enables us to perform our analytics, and we are then able to find problems. It's really important at WindEsco that after we find that problem, we help you fix it. So after we find it, we give solutions and we work side by side with how to implement changes that correct the problem. And we still don't finish there. The last thing we like to do is measure it. So after we found it and fixed it, then we measure it to ensure you can take a case back to your stakeholders in a quantified fashion and demonstrate an acceptable ROI, not an estimate and not a ballpark.
That's I love that. That is fantastic. And for the listeners, we were talking offline prior to this about estimating or anticipating ROI. What I love about what you guys are able to do is give that exact marker. As you've mentioned, identify the problem, help organize the data, use your analytics to then create a solution, and then say, hey, here's the impact that we had for your site's operations. To me, that's critical, especially as wind continues to mature, is that transparency, that level of data transparency, and how sites are operating can continue to improve their operations. I wanted to ask, what could you maybe give an example or recurring themes that you see with different operators that you do work with? Like, what are some of the primary challenges that you guys have been able to identify and then solve?
Sure. I think on that spectrum, you have to get into organizational behavior a little bit. Large organizations operate different than small organizations, even though they might have the same business. A large organization is going to be data rich with a lot of horsepower behind databases and tools. However, they're going to have more organizational challenges, and they might, need to navigate through things differently than an organization that has one or two decision makers. The smaller organization, on the other hand, has a little bit less for resourcing and a little bit less in the area of data, and they have to rely on outsourcing a lot more in some cases. In the middle, you see a complete mixture. And I think that depends on the maturity spectrum for how new someone is to be in a middle range. A middle range might be, 2 gigawatts of assets or more, but not, but below, let's say 10 gigawatts. And within that space, some of those are self-performing, some of those are under contract, some of those are using in-source tools, some of those are using outsourced tools. And because of that variety, those customers don't follow a clear pattern. So that's one aspect of it. In general, everyone shares the challenge of not having data standards and having to rely on some historian company, some way of internally or externally visualizing your performance so that as humans we can interact with it, and then figuring out an analytics philosophy. And as we get into WindEsco, if someone's just starting a site and can't keep their turbines online, they may not be the right time to be looking at optimizing. But for that other owner who's got availability down pat and has control of the business, and they haven't worked on efficiency, that's where we come in as a good fit to bring in that additional power production most often.
You mentioned efficiency. Do you mind expanding on that and maybe giving specific examples? For instance, in the case study, I believe I'd seen something to do with the yaw system and maybe inaccuracies of reporting, or the turbine wasn't actually yawing 100% into the wind. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that and use that potentially as an example of identifying those inefficiencies?
Yeah, I hope so, because we actually think we are the leader in yaw misalignment correction. And that's really where we've got our legacy customers and track record from in analytics. And it's from those principles that we have applied to other aspects of the turbine to deliver on online improvement. The words efficiency and optimization can be applied to availability and other aspects in business. And because of that, it's easy to get confused about who's really optimizing or bringing efficiency. So the key differentiator when we use the word optimize is that we're helping adjustments to the things that move when the turbine's on. In the case of the yaw system, a very simple principle can be demonstrated with a pinwheel or even a box fan in your backyard. So if there's a breeze and you twist it, you can twist it to a point where your box fan or pinwheel will stop spinning. And then you can twist it to a point where it spins faster. On smaller increments, our wind turbines are doing that in the wrong directions. And we have found that on average, 2/3 of the wind turbines on owner sites are not correctly pointing into the wind. When that happens, just as you can see with your pinwheel or your box fan, or if you're a sailor with your jib or mainsail, you're not catching the wind accurately. You have to adjust something to catch that wind. We apply that with data and principles to make the correction on those turbines.
And as a result, you're able to see an annual increase in your AEP, right? On top of that, the revenue production of the site.
That's correct. Imagine, something performing 100 kilowatts better or several hundred kilowatts better per day, 365 days a year.
That impact is massive. And I guess this is more of a personal question from me, definitely not prompted prior to this call, but is that yaw misalignment, is that measured in degrees, or how is that measured? And then if it is measured, how small of a shift in that yaw misalignment can actually cause downstream effects of not capturing all the wind? Is it a degree? Is it as small as a half a degree, or is it larger than that, 10 degrees off, if that is the unit of measure, I guess?
Yeah, it's measured in degrees. There's a formula involving the things we were supposed to remember in high school, like cosine, that you use to apply to estimate the impact of a degree of error to AEP loss. And what you see is that negligence within one or two or a few degrees has a marginal impact to AEP. After 5 degrees or more, it has a significant impact to AEP. If you and I were to try to eyeball that from the ground, we would be unable to notice 5 degrees or even 10 degrees.
Yeah, it's minuscule, especially with a tower that could be 80 meters up, and you're looking up at the tower and you're thinking to yourself, oh, this looks like it's 2 degrees off or 5 degrees off. To me, that would be absolutely crazy to be able to pinpoint. So I think I just really want to highlight that importance of the accuracy of your technology and what you're able to capture in those data sets that you're looking at, those analytics. I guess that would prompt the next question of accuracy of the data. Do you have a particular number of, hey, we're 100% accurate, or do you work towards that 100% accuracy of the data that you're sifting through and then validate on the back end? Could you maybe talk about just the accuracy portion of when you're sifting through data and presenting a solution to your customer?
Yeah, I think that is important. And there's 2 points I want to bring up. First is, what data are you looking at? And within what increments? So you can look at data and see a lot about the 1 second data. That is a huge differentiator for accurate analytics with models that require certain inputs to work. You can't look at any data and find out any change and measure it. Accuracy comes into the measurement aspect of how we tell you what changed and how well it's performing. Our measurement method is proprietary. It's DNV approved, and it has a degree of error of less than 0.5%. That is unlike most of the measurement methods we've seen in the past 10 years. And because of that, imagine how much performance improvement is being left on the table if someone thinks 2% isn't worth pursuing because it's within the old degree of error. By measuring more accurately, we're able to deliver more value to owners.
That's a fantastic answer. And it's fascinating to me. You'd mentioned cosine in high school principles for math. I definitely need a refresher after this call, man. You're definitely schooling me here and taking me back to school per se. I actually wanted to move on to the future of your technology. I think what you're doing now is fascinating. I think it has a ton of value for the wind market, especially. We've already talked about who would be a good candidate. You've talked about the different types of owner operators. Some are self-performing, some might be under a service contract. What can we expect from WindEsco maybe over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of new tech releases or new things that you bring into the table?
Yeah, and thanks for asking because I think it's a tough question. Seeing where we were 10 years ago in wind, most turbines didn't even have vibration sensors in them. We've seen that area of our industry change dramatically, and you've had some guests on who use similar sensors to help owners now, to where that's so sophisticated. You don't even need really to monitor it. It's being monitored with AI. It's being sent to cell phones, and we are getting so much better at predicting. Where WindEsco in the optimization analytics is going to change is that we're going to go from just looking at individual turbines, which is what we do now, and usually doesn't get done, right? Most folks are looking at whole site. That individual level assessment is so important. But if you're going to get into how those turbines perform as it relates to something like wake or dynamic yaw, how does that wind turbine twist when the wind changes? Those turbines need to be able to communicate together. And outside of OEM controllers and OEM R&D, there's not a lot really pushing on that envelope. And that's where you're going to see WindEsco take to the next level, is getting that smart phrase IoT capability out to get sites performing better within themselves rather than just individual unit analytics.
That's fascinating to me. And I guess I'd almost made the assumption that a lot of these towers and the interconnectivity, the IoT that you just referenced, was already happening. Would you say there's a large need and need for a push, I guess you should say, in that IoT aspect of wind? Or is that something that's in development and being rolled out now? And if so, when do you anticipate we'll start to see more of that out in the field?
Yeah, general answer is yes, absolutely. There's a need for it. Onshore turbines have been scrapped down to the minimal needs to operate, such as singular sensor principles or no sensors in some cases, compared with a military ship or an offshore turbine. They have redundancy built in that helps them. So because of that, our ability to apply analytics has been just characteristically limited. As we go into the next few years, I think what we're going to see change is the understanding of what data to look for and ways to get around data limitation barriers. Many of the tools we're using right now are limited by the services or the products that you're using. So if you have a dashboard telling you what's wrong, it's only as good as the data coming in. And if you're comparing that with another dashboard company, but the data source has inherent issues or lack of standards, then the industry's ability to work together and grow on benefits that people can apply across the market will continue to be limited. That's where we'll see changes.
What are some other data limitations that you've seen in just interacting with the wind market over the last 12 plus years? And I guess more recently, some areas where maybe you've seen improvement, but you still see as limitations to different owner operators' data?
Again, so there's no one way that asset producers, the OEMs, have to make the data get shared. So they all have their own methods. Secondarily, there's no one way that is all supposed to be kept. So if I give you 5 OEMs, you're going to be getting data information for the same rotor or blade, but with a different name. that you have to manage as an owner. Where do you put that? Do you just use it as it comes out, or do you save it so you can look at it later? And when you do that, how much do you save? Do you save every tag for every second? Or do you save some tags for every second and some tags for 10 minutes and some tags for 1 day? Well, how do you know that? Because that for many smaller and less sophisticated owners hasn't been learned. And because the OEMs can do much of what they want any way they want it, you have such a variety coming out of our assets that's keeping analytics from congealing beneficially to a broader market.
I appreciate that you talking more in depth about that, because I think it really highlights the need for what you're doing at WindEsco from the data side, the engineering and analytics side. I'm not sure, and I don't want to speak on behalf of our customers, but I would say it's something that they're aware of, but not 100% in tune and focused with. And so I think you're really servicing the underserved portion of the wind market and are really on the cutting edge of potentially even influencing that global standard across different OEMs, which sounds like is very much well needed. So I just want to commend you guys on your efforts there. And I think it's fantastic what you've been able to do thus far.
Thanks. Yeah, and I hope it helps. And until it improves, that's why we spend so much time and are somewhat picky about the data we need to show that differentiated performance output.
So this next question before the rapid fire round, I want to give you an opportunity to brag. Could you just talk me through a recent win or a big win that you could potentially share with us?
Yeah, I think the one that's pretty neat is that there's an ongoing debate about that topic you asked about earlier about yaw misalignment. And it's been out there for years, and the way we've tried to address it has varied. And I think there's been mixed success. And in many cases, many people have tuned it out as an issue because it just hasn't been solved, or because they don't think it's real. One of the accepted methods to look for that is using lasers and what we call LiDARs. And they look at little particles in the air and compare that with how the particles are interacting with the turbine. So it's a very precise way to get data on wind direction, wind speed, and other aspects of the aerodynamics. The equipment to do that is expensive. And you can't put one on every turbine because we have a volume problem in renewables. Instead of one massive, 4 gigawatt gas turbine, we have 400 or 200 1.5 megawatt machines. So it's harder to invest in that volume. By using data only, we get rid of the owner's need to have to buy hardware to look at the wind. And so we have conducted a case study with a large partner who essentially conducted an Olympics comparison between the LiDAR methods and some of those service providers with our data only analytics method. And we're happy to say we were successful. And because of that, we'll be expanding within that owner's fleet. I've talked to about a half a dozen owners doing the same thing. They're conducting Olympic comparisons, as I call them, to see which method is best. And we're confident that as we get out there, we'll demonstrate this technically works and that this has a value that's 50 times greater than investing in hardware to do the same job.
Wow. So you're using data to actually replace hardware that would have to be purchased and installed on these towers. That's correct? One second, Sam. Sorry. We'll edit this out. Go ahead. Again, my bad. The Wi-Fi cut out.
Yeah, no problem. Not just purchased, but purchased and then installed and then removed and reinstalled on every single turbine, because you can't apply the findings and mitigations from one unit to every other unit. The solution varies on a unit by unit basis. Because of that, yes, the data approach is scalable and is more affordable for owners to implement.
That is great. That is awesome to hear. And I just appreciate the overview about WindEsco, what your background's in, how you guys are solving problems in the field. I guess you should say growing pains, because the market is exploding. It looks like by 2030, we might have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. Onshore is booming. It looks to be that culturally we're really accepting wind now more often than ever. So I just think what your company and you especially have been able to accomplish, Sam, has been fantastic. And I'm very, very interested to see how this evolves over time. As we talked about leveraging your technology into the future, Internet of Things, and replacing maybe some of the antiquated ways that we thought we were collecting data and having no standard. So I just want to say thank you for that. Are you ready for the rapid fire round?
I'll give it a try.
Give it a shot. All right, so this is a favorite question of mine. You had mentioned you never pursued renewables. I personally did not pursue it initially in my career, but I ended up here and I absolutely love it. Getting to know people like yourself, the close-knit community of people who are passionate about what they do and passionate about the growth of wind. What would you say to somebody who wants to get into wind? Maybe that exception to our case, but doesn't know where to start. Where would you tell them to look, and how would you tell them to approach that career seeking process?
Yeah, 10 years ago, you couldn't find someone who was educated in renewables. There were no programs. And the best people to work at a wind farm specifically were either farmers, military veterans, or 2-year degree students from aviation tech schools. That combination, if you can find that combination, you have a rock star. Nowadays, you can go to get a 2-year degree in a variety of things, from business acumen to technical acumen, and apply that at owners, OEMs, or service providers. And so because I went this path, I think going in the field and seeing it was extremely beneficial. However, if you have a business acumen, getting into one of those same styles of businesses as an analyst or business development specialist, and just getting involved is going to be critical. One point of advice I would share for everyone in wind is when you get into wind, and solar is going to be the same way, and even fossils the same way. These are lean, extremely lean businesses. Those organizations run lean and deal with the same challenges, whether you go from this lean org to this lean org. And it will be hard work, but it will be rewarding, and it'll be there for the rest of our lifetimes.
I love that. That's fantastic. And it's cool that you've talked about your previous experience in getting into wind and how it's changed as well. I think it's always nice to have that gratitude of the programs and opportunities that have presented themselves in the last 10 years. And I'm sure it'll only become increasingly more visible in the next 10 years. Speaking of 10 years down the line, another favorite question of mine to ask is, and we already talked about WindEsco, how you're changing, but how do you anticipate wind changes over the next 10 years, the market as a whole, both onshore and offshore in the United States and globally?
Yeah, so wind owners who were progressive enough with their businesses can afford to continue building and growing onshore. Many will not be able to without the PTC. You'll see mergers and acquisitions happen as a result of that. And the new installations onshore will decline, and the amount of focus on OpEx instead of CapEx will shift. The CapEx is going to shift to offshore and solar. 80% of the owners onshore are in solar now. If you make a list and do the research, it's remarkable how many people are playing in that space. And based on the statistics, solar will overshadow wind. And I forget which year, but perhaps it was in the next decade or so that solar will outgrow wind. Offshore, I'm still a little bit of a skeptic about, but we see contracts and plans going in place finally, where we'll see operating offshore turbines en masse off North America and Asia going into the next decade as well. That will keep the OEMs solvent, who have had a really competitive and tough time onshore. And then we'll see, those things you and I talked about too, with tech and service innovations supporting the aging onshore fleet.
Yeah, that's great. I like that you talked about the mergers and acquisitions, offshore and solar. Those are definitely things we're keeping our eye on as well internally at Kurz. It seems that there will be a consolidation of OEMs and likely these owner operators as well in the onshore space, Now, the offshore space to me is so fresh and new. I don't know where it'll end up. It looks like the Great Lakes are a great candidate right now for some offshore towers. You got the East Coast, but then you also have some shallower waters off the West Coast in some areas. So it'll be interesting to see where we place these different towers and how that eventually comes to be. I actually want to flip back into wind careers. You had mentioned that you had no anticipation of getting into wind initially, renewables, and you ended up here and you're here to stay. What is that unique characteristic about wind that has allowed you to stay in the market and thrive and also really enjoy it?
You know, there were two parallels that I made from that transition in my experience from the Navy to renewables, which was that technical aspect of operating equipment to teams and leadership. You know, getting out around people who take care of equipment and working together to make it run as well as possible. That's a general way of describing many businesses, but that was a good transferable reason for me. And it also felt good, you know, to go from a meaningful industry like the U.S. military to the renewable sector, even before it got trendy and popular, you know, 10 and 15 years ago. It was, you know, largely unspoken of. It wasn't that much in the mainstream media, but it felt like the right thing to do, and everybody knew it was catching on, especially at a place like NextEra. They were fully invested years ahead. And to be a part of a leading innovative company like that was invaluable.
Good answer. I love that. I'm going to throw you a curveball here. Spontaneous, on the spot, no preparation. So you mentioned you're in Orlando, Florida, correct?
That's right.
What is one area of Florida, if one was to vacation, and obviously Florida has the beaches, the warm waters, the Mai Tais for whatever reason are fantastic down there. I don't know what it is. I honeymooned out of Florida and enjoyed the Mai Tais. Could have been the experience because I just got married. But what is one area of Florida that you feel more people should go visit?
Oh, geez.
Putting you on the spot here.
If you haven't been to the Keys, you got to go to the Keys. If you haven't been to Tampa St. Pete, you have to go there. Don't forget, running through the middle of Florida is something called the River of Grass, and we have natural springs and crystal clear water that you can swim in. It's a little chilly, you know, 15, 60-degree springs, but beautiful aspects of nature in Old Florida. If you like to party, go to Miami and West Palm. If you like the beach, any of the major cities, and a half hour to an hour outside of those has any of the world's best beaches that you can go to. I can't give you one place because I've lived here and I'm obviously a fan. So
love it, and I appreciate you taking the curveball and turning on it, and it's over the left field wall. You did a great job there. Last question, and I have to give the kudos to the originator of this question, Tim Ferriss, author of the 4-Hour Workweek, has a great podcast that you can find online. He likes to ask his guests to wrap up his podcasts with a particular question. I think it's really impactful and meaningful and dives deep into the person that you're actually talking to. He always says, if you were to put a quote on a billboard for the entire world to see, so it has to fit on a billboard, what would that quote say?
Oh boy. Got data.
Got data. I love it. I love it. The WindEsco plug. That's fantastic. Might be the best answer I've had yet.
That's it. Short and sweet.
Got data. Well, that's fantastic. That wraps up our podcast today, episode 13 of the Kurz Wind Podcast. Sam, again, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this. You obviously know what you're talking about. Before we sign off here, how can people find you and then also find WindEsco?
Yeah, thanks for asking, and thanks for that personal plug. I'm on LinkedIn, and being in sales, my phone number is on my contact info, unlike most people. WindEsco's website is www.windesco.com. It's ever changing, and we're aggressively working out there because we feel like we have an obligation to help owners find this improvement that we have to offer.
I think it's great, and for the listeners out there too, in the show notes, we'll put Sam's LinkedIn, personal LinkedIn. Maybe we'll even put your phone number out there. See how many phone calls we can get over to you, Sam.
Anything other than the spam that we get all the time is going to be great.
I know some guys that realize that your car's out of warranty and they want to sell you extended warranty. So I'll make sure I send your number to them personally. But I kid. But we'll put your personal LinkedIn under the show notes. We'll also do a little write-up about our conversation today. For those of you who want to recap this, but read it in a more of a visual format, we'll link WindEsco's website. And then also, obviously we'll put some of your contact information through WindEsco underneath the show notes. But again, Sam, I really enjoyed this conversation today. It's a long time coming. And I wish you luck and just, again, really appreciate it.
Thanks. Nice job. Nice hosting and great podcast. Thanks, Daniel.
Appreciate it, Sam.